Hi, welcome to week 4, module 5, the content lecture on second generation feminist arts and de-centered subjectivity. So we're going to start off this lecture with a rather long introduction to the main kind of theoretical ideas that inform the work of the three major artists that we'll be covering for this week: Cindy Sherman, Barbara Kruger, and Jenny Holzer. And what this then necessitates is a discussion of some of the key features of the contemporary age that we live in, postmodernism, in relation to modernism and some of the big differences between those, an introduction to critical theory, particularly the thinking of a number of French, oftentimes described as post-structuralist thinkers such as Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, and to a lesser extent Jacques Derrida, and semiotic theory, which informs their work. Before we even get into the artists today, these are big, very important arguments. They are things that are very established arguments today, but when they first came out in the 1960s and were adopted by the artists that we're using to some extent in the later 1970s into the 80s and into contemporary practice, they were fairly new and kind of revolutionary in the way that they describe the way that both identity formation works and how important representations are in legislating and defining us as what now we call subjects rather than identity. But we'll come back to that in a moment here. So stick with me. I'm going to try to go at these theoretical concepts in a number of different ways, starting very simply, going into more complex arguments, and then trying to bring it back to more simple arguments. I'm going to try to employ as many different examples as I can use, all, of course, with the effort being to get us to a place where we can understand all of the complexities that are at work here, both in these artists' works as well as in questions about how we understand gender. And from this point forward, we'll start seeing these ideas show up when we're talking about race and ethnicity and sexuality and other things. The basic argument here is kind of simple. So we'll start with that very simply, that the difference that we find between first generation feminist arts in the United States and what we're calling the second generation of feminist artists, those who are anti-essentialists, who are much more informed by post-structuralist theory, is that for the second generation, identity is not something that is essential. It's not something that has any kind of biological component to it that is particularly important when it comes to both the way that we gain a sense of ourselves as well as the way that we understand others in the world. And instead, what they argue is that gender is a construct. It's a category that is constructed by societal assumptions, big ideological presuppositions that are inherent in our world, and that these things set up oppositions between the genders, which privileges one, the male, over the female, and that the big goal of all of this is, on the one hand, to raise our consciousness of how important representations are when it comes to how we understand ourselves and others, and to deconstruct those that are particularly pernicious or destructive when it comes to, misaligning or creating asymmetrical relations to power between the different genders. So I'd like to start off with something kind of simple here by talking about postmodernism, which of course is the historical age that we live in, and it's a very kind of general term that is applied to the age we live in. And I'm not going to get into any of the big contested arguments about what postmodernism actually is. But I do want to kind of foreground a number of things that are fundamental to our age. Things that, if you're going to seek a kind of historical moment in which postmodernism really starts to gain the public attention, or at least gain kind of scholarly attention, it's in the mid-60s to late 60s, particularly with a group of French thinkers known as the post-structuralists, who all started, by the way, as structuralist thinkers. And we're not going to get into the specific designation of post-structuralism here today. Something that I wanted to use as a term in case you come across it in upper division classes, and just so that you're familiar with that term there. So the first thing to say is that what you're looking at here on the screen, on the left-hand side, the image, is a painting by the Belgian artist, a surrealist by the name of René Magritte, that is called The Human Condition. And what you see then is a painting, and it's set up in a very kind of typical Renaissance way. It's a painting of a scene out of a window primarily. But in front of that window, what we have is the artist has set up an easel with a canvas on that easel that's been painted to, as far as we can tell, exactly replicate the scene that would occur outside of the window. And the only way we can really tell that that is a canvas in front of the window is by noticing that on the right-hand side of the canvas, we can see the stretched canvas with its staples in it. And we can see that it's set up on an easel, and over on the left-hand side, it just barely kind of covers up part of the curtain so that we know that something's in front of that window. Now, René Magritte called this the human condition, and what he was trying to draw our awareness to back in 1933 or so was that between us and everything in the world, something that inflects our experience of the world is a representation. Now, representations, as we've covered in this class, are signs. They are anything that has meaning. They can be a word, they can be a concept, they can be an image. But what René Magritte is trying to point out is that they are like lenses through which we see the world. They are not the same as the world. A representation is a stand-in for something that inflects our view of the world. So here it's kind of simple. It's just a painting that is a representation of a landscape. But the bigger idea that he's getting at is that, again, there are representations that mediate our experience of the world. In fact, there's no way that we can directly experience the world without thinking about that world in terms of concepts and words and images and what we already know about the world, for instance. So, for instance, we can say that when you're talking to someone else, the medium through which you communicate is a representation. It's usually spoken or written language. Sometimes when you're trying to think your way through a really hard concept, of course you have to represent it in terms of words or in terms of metaphors or what have you. These are all representations. And of course, in our topic for today, where we're thinking about gender, gender is a representation according to the second generation of feminist artists. It's not something that is essential. It's not something that is biologically determinative. You're not born into the world as a woman. As Simone de Beauvoir pointed out in the mid-50s, you become a woman by basically fashioning yourself in accordance with the representations of femininity or a woman that are already in existence in the world around you. The reason I start here is that a key kind of tenet of postmodernist and post-structuralist thought is that there are no sovereign truths, nothing that is universally and timelessly valid for all people of all times and all places. Rather, according to post-structuralist thinking, truth is contingent, right? Truth is something that is constructed by presuppositions held by a society at a particular moment in time. In other words, we represent the world to ourselves, and those representations are not objective, but rather subjective, meaning that the meaning and values that derive from representations don't come from intrinsic or essential truths, but rather from ideological assumptions or presuppositions about what the world really is, or in this case, what gender really is, that then function as these lenses through which we see things such as gender. Now, I started off this quarter kind of letting you think a little bit about what your own sense of self was, your own individuality, or your own kind of identity. And I didn't give you a lot of kind of historical ways of thinking about this to help guide you, because I wanted you to, to keep this a little bit messy, to have to think your way through it, and hopefully that would give you a little bit greater insight than supplying you with traditional ways of thinking about identity. But here I want to kind of supply a couple of general ideas that come to us through modernism, the period preceding postmodernism, and frankly going all the way back to the Renaissance and before, in order to help us on our way. For a postmodernist, there is no sovereign individuality. We are not born into the world with a sense of self. Rather, our sense of self is something that is constructed in relation to representations in the world around us that we internalize and identify with, and continue to kind of self-surveil and fashion ourselves in accordance with. Let's say traditionally, if we use an example, let's say taken out of Judeo-Christian belief, and you could use a number of different world religions. It goes all the way back to, frankly, even the Egyptians had ideas like this, that all people are born into the world with a soul, a unique soul, and that soul is different than anyone else's soul, and that over the course of your life, that soul reaches its maturity. Your individuality is basically a function of that uniqueness of your soul, that either, is supported by society in various ways, or is not. So one example of this would be, to link this to first generation feminist ideas about essentialism. Their belief was, not entirely, you can't use this kind of generically and say that they all fully believe this, but over and again we saw the first generation of feminist artists believing that there was something kind of essential to the gender of the feminine, and that they were seeking a recovery of that essential quality of the feminine, and that what had occurred is that society, based upon patriarchal values, really didn't support the full kind of flowering of femininity, so that they needed to redefine and revalue those characteristics of the feminine that weren't supported by patriarchal society. That's a kind of basic parallel to this idea of being born into the world with a unique soul. It's something that I know every parent usually tells their child, you're unique and special and there's no one like you, and so forth. But what a postmodernist would say is that actually that's not true at all. That historically what has occurred is that only a few people are actually designated as individuals in the true sense of the word. People who have agency in the world, who are able to affect change, who are able to exercise power, who are able to, to have self-determination and so forth. These are the higher members of society traditionally that are afforded this individuality, while as the rest of the vast majority of people are fettered from reaching or attaining that individuality. A postmodernist or post-structuralist would say, though, that there is no unique sense of self at all, that we're born into the world more or less as kind of, we have our own predilections, they would usually say, but we are, for the most part, kind of blank slates onto which society imprints its values, and that we internalize these values and fashion ourselves in accordance with the expectations that society has for us. And one of the big ones has to do with, our own sense of gender. So our sense of self, then, for a postmodernist and a post-structuralist is something that is constructed and interpreted according to representations that exist in the world around us. One of the big representations being, of course, gender for a post-structuralist thinker. Now, as you'll hear over and again, post-structuralist and postmodernist thinkers believe that gender is a construct that legislates and defines our subjectivity, right? Our subjectivity. And we'll come back to that term. Why are we using the term subjectivity or a subject rather than individuality or identity now? One way to get at this is to start to think about how representations work, or how a sign, which is a form of representation, actually gains its meaning. So we're going to, in just a moment, start talking about semiotic theory, which is the theory about coming out of linguistics about how signs gain their actual meaning. But before we get to that, let's just kind of delve into this idea of the subject for a minute here. A subject, let's just start with this. A subject, we're basically just kind of substituting the word identity for the word subject. But there's a reason that this is being done. One of the reasons is that what people want to point out when they use the term a subject or subjectivity is that our sense of identity is subject to representations that already kind of exist in the world before we're born into it, and that we are subject to those representations as we come to understand ourselves and fashion ourselves, and we're subject to those representations when we understand others and even understand ourselves. One of the resonances of this that might be useful to you is to think about how in old monarchical cultures, the king was the authority. He legislated everything, right? Made all the rules, determined what was and what was not acceptable in society, ranging from basic laws to, how people were supposed to be in that society. He was the authority. All of the people who lived under the king were known as his subjects, right? So they are subject to these rules, this authority. Now, if you just kind of trip that over into the realm of contemporary life, what you would say is that the authority that exists in the world are representations here, kind of common norms, presuppositions, ideological assumptions about, what one gender is versus another, and that we're all subject to those rules, right? Our sense of self, our subjectivity is subject to those rules in society. Or you might think about this in terms of the traditional notion of the family, a nuclear family, where the father is understood as the head of the household, the one who makes the rules, the kind of authoritative figure in the household, and the rest of the family members are his subjects. Or you can think in terms of language. This is key here as well. All of these major postmodernists and post-structuralist thinkers were linguistic theoreticians at some stage in their careers. And so if you think about what a subject is in a sentence, right? The subject is the authority figure in the sentence. It's the figure that has agency. It's the figure that moves the action. It's the figure to whom all the actions refer back to. Or you think about, let's say, a book, and a narrative book with a main protagonist. That main protagonist is basically the figure that drives all of the action that is occurring, to which the entire plot kind of refers to. It's, though, the reason I bring up this kind of idea of a subject being a component of a sentence or of a narrative is to say that within these sentences, a subject only becomes a subject according to its positionality within either the sentence or within the narrative. There's nothing intrinsic to his power or his ability to move the action. It's rather his placement within the system that determines whether someone will recognize him as a subject having power or not, right? So think about this again in terms of a book, a narrative sequence, or a movie that has a major protagonist. In a way, the rules of the game, the authority to which the subject has to gain its position, is the narrative itself, the kind of narrative arc, so to speak, of the entire story. That figure gains his power in relation to that narrative sequence and is able to do things, achieve self-determination, move the action, defeat villains, and so forth because of the way he is positioned within that system. So those are just a few examples of the subject, and I'll keep returning to this. Now let's return to semiotic theory. Semiotic theory is basically a set of linguistic theories about how signs mean what they do. And for the purposes of our class, we're really focusing on what is called a linguistic sign or a conventional sign. There are other types of signs, slight moderation of this theory when you're looking at those signs. But in this one, we have to get some kind of basic terminology under our belt. And so stick with me. On the right-hand side of the split screen, you see a diagram with three different terms: signifier, signified, and signs. Now, what this diagram is meant to inform you of is that for a semiotician, a sign, which is anything that conveys meaning, so let's start with a word, a sign, anything that conveys meaning has two components to it, a signifier and a signified. Let's take the word apple, either written or spoken, A-P-P-L-E. That word itself, when you read it or when you hear it, is the signifier. The resultant mental image that you get in your head when you hear the word apple or read the word apple is the signified. It's the image you get in your head. The signifier and the signified together are a sign. Now I want to add one more term to this, which is on your lecture guide. A sign, let's say the word apple now, also refers to something in the real world, that real fruit, an apple. And in this way, we call that thing that it refers to in the real world, its referent. Now, why am I making this complicated, right? Why do I want to point out that a sign has two components and that there's, a sign and then there's the thing it refers to? Well, signs are representations. And the reason to split these things, a sign into these component parts, is to say something pretty important, which is that in this sign, a linguistic or conventional sign, the relationship between the signifier, meaning the word or the sound apple, and its signified, the image that you get in your head when I say or you read the word apple, is a matter of a convention. There's no intrinsic or natural link between the word and the mental image that it calls up in your head. Nor is there any intrinsic or natural link between a sign, in this case again the word apple, and the real apple that it refers to in the world. It's a matter of convention. You need to learn it. A representation stands in for the thing. Apple stands in as a word for the thing, the real apple in the world, but there's no intrinsic link between these. It's a matter of convention. You have to learn that that word or that series of letters means apple, that fruit that's in the real world. It's what semioticians call an arbitrary or motivated relationship between a sign and its referent. Now, the importance of this is to say that if it's a matter of convention, if all representations are linked to what they represent according to this kind of conventional understanding, and you can just use a symbol, right? Any symbol is more or less motivated or a matter of convention. Think of the peace symbol. There's nothing intrinsic about that symbol that means peace. We have to learn it. The reason that we point this out is to say that in between a representation and the thing it represents are a whole host of presumptions that are informed by the ideology or set of beliefs that are inherent in the culture at that time period. That's kind of the glue that holds them together, or what comes along with a representation. So let's move this over to gender, for instance. If the sign is, let's say, woman, what it signifies is, a real body in the world out there that is marked by particular differences from the male, having a vagina and particular genitalia that is different than the male genitalia. But the meaning that accrues to that body is a matter of convention. It's motivated. You have to learn the link between that word woman and what it is supposed to represent. And in between, then, that word woman and the real body are a whole host of presumptions and presuppositions. Nothing natural or true or essential that links them together, but rather a whole set of representations that are informed by ideological assumptions that are a part of the society that, in which we all live. So again, let's move back to this. I want you to think of your body as a sign, which is encoded and read according to societal assumptions and conventions. There's nothing natural or inevitable about being born with the sexual biology of a woman or a man that then gives rise to the meanings that accrue to that body. That body is just a sign that then is interpreted both by yourself as well as by others. And of course, you use that body to interpret other people as well, according to this field of representation around you that is informed by ideological assumptions. Another way to go at this is to just make this a little bit more complex in some ways, and to harken this back to ideas that we first confronted when we were looking at John Berger's ways of seeing, where he, of course, pointed out that women are constantly surveying themselves. And in that iteration of this argument, what John Berger was primarily interested in pointing out is that women fashion themselves in accordance to a kind of male view of themselves that is, existing in their head that they've internalized. He was primarily interested in the question of how their physical appearance, which is given such a high kind of priority in our culture, is so highly seemingly valued by culture, that they see themselves and fashion their physical appearance in relation to the expectations of the society around us. What you're looking at on the screen now is an illustration of an old prison known as a panopticon. The panopticon was a prison that was circular with a central kind of guard tower in the middle where guards could observe the open chambers of all the prisoners at all hours of the day. It was kind of a hidden interior so that the guards, although it was really apparent obviously, no one could see the guards, but the guards could see all of the prisoners and see what they were up to. And of course there are various rules that are in place in these prisons which the prisoners are meant to conform to. Now, when Michel Foucault used this illustration as a part of his argument in a famous text called Discipline and Punish, what he wanted to point out is that it didn't take very long until the prisoners had internalized the idea of guards watching them all of the time. And so that even if there weren't guards in this tower watching them, they had to believe that there were and act according to believing that they were constantly being surveilled. He called this dynamic self-surveillance, right? That we see ourselves through the presumed eyes of others and fashion ourselves according to those, expectations of these others. But then he pushed this even further. He wanted to say, and I'll bring this up again when we talk about Jacques Lacan in a moment, that this happens to everyone all the time, that guard tower might be seen as a metaphor for all of the expectations and presumptions and ideological assumptions and presuppositions that are inherent in a culture. In broad brushstrokes, we call this the field of representations, right? All of these representations, in this case, let's just kind of limit this to gender, about expectations about what woman is versus what man is, what a woman is expected to be versus what a man is expected to be, and so forth. And that field of representation here, metaphorically defined as this guard tower, is in our heads. We internalize it, and then we fashion ourselves and act out or perform our genders according to those representations that we've come into contact with throughout our entire life. It's become internalized. There's a simpler way to put this. Let's start with the simple. If that's, if you're struggling with this idea, let's just start with this one. If you've ever been in a situation in which, let's say in your everyday life, you have noticed yourself around a certain group of friends really manifesting components of your personality in a very particular way, and then around another group of friends, a different set of components of your personality manifest itself, right? Or you're around your parents and you notice yourself acting a little differently than you would around a group of friends, or let's say you're in a very professional situation, or you're in a classroom and you're acting, with your classroom or professional persona manifesting itself. That's all functioning according to this logic of self-surveillance. You are fashioning yourself and fashioning your behavior and even your looks according to the presumed expectations of that group of friends around you. Now, you might think of this as extending way beyond that as well. It's not just friends, it's not just people, but that we fashion ourselves in relation to representations as well, whether those be books or movies or magazines or words or whatever we've come into contact with. When I'm in face-to-face classrooms, one of the ways that I make students really aware of this is to put them into a situation in which they feel incredibly self-conscious and can witness their own self-surveillance firsthand. And the way that I do this, and I hope everyone will at least entertain the idea of doing this. I know it's a difficult kind of viewing exercise to perform, but I hope you'll try it at least, is to say to these students, go pick a partner, one person, maybe someone you're comfortable with, but it doesn't need to be. And for 2 minutes, I would like you to look directly into their eyes while they look directly into your eyes. I would like you to be as aware of all the things that are going through your head as you can, and to try your best not to talk, which will, release some tension and frankly destroy what I'm trying to do by creating a defense mechanism for this. And what students will say over and again, I hope you do this because it's something that will kind of teach you what this is all about very quickly, is that they'll notice very quickly that they are starting to see themselves through the presumptive eyes of others, right? They'll begin to wonder what the other person sees of them. And it's not just their physical appearance. It's more than that, what they're wearing, what their glasses might be, how they're acting, whether they look incredibly self-conscious or very confident, all of those things, they become aware of, and they try to control it. They try to fashion themselves in relation to what they believe others are seeing in them. That's self-surveillance, and it's a constituent part of the way that we perform our sense of self in the world. So then, let's complicate this even further. One of the most important theorists, and someone who informed a lot of the thinking on this subject, and is, very, very important thinker for, in particular, Barbara Kruger's work, is the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who was a member of this post-structuralist group. He was a practicing psychoanalyst as well. And basically what he did is he took Freud and he kind of converted Freud's ideas into, or understood them through semiotic theory, so changed them around and really emphasized the idea of self-surveillance and the important function that representations have when it comes to understanding ourselves and others. So you see here on the screen is just a brief little kind of recap of a famous article that he wrote called The Mere Stage of Development. It's a longer title than that, but that's how it's usually referred to, in which he is trying to describe, as many psychologists do, the way that a child enters into a sense of self through various stages. And while they're all a little bit different, if you're looking at psychoanalytic or psychological theory, many of them have this kind of same scaffolding to the process through which we develop an ego or sense of self, or what before we have been calling identity, and what Jacques Lacan and others are now calling subjectivity. So for Jacques Lacan, all children are born into the world, and most psychologists believe this, without any sense of self, no ego and no ego boundaries. We're all born into the world basically seeing ourselves as coextensive with our surroundings. We don't understand a difference between ourselves and our parents or siblings. We are just, we haven't developed an ego or kind of any separation from the world around us. Somewhere around 6 months or so, when children begin to develop the very beginning stages of representation, right, the ability to make a sound that is understood as a desire that needs to be fulfilled by mother or father, they go through what Jacques Lacan called the mere stage of development, which he described as a kind of misrecognition of ourself through representations. And all of this again occurs right at the beginning of the acquisition of language, which is really important here, because what we're going to see is that we understand ourselves and come to a sense of ourselves through representations that are outside of ourselves. That's why we use the term de-centered subjectivity. Our subjectivity or sense of self is not centered within ourselves. It's not a product of our unique soul that comes to fruition. Our sense of self is something that is adapted or internalized from outside of ourselves and continues to inflect our sense of self through a field of representations through which we gain validity and value and meaning of who we are. So this is the way he describes it, very simply, very literally at first. He says, around 6 months of age, the child, for instance, might see himself in a reflective surface or a mirror. And that child will see himself or herself and recognize themselves through that mirror, like, oh, that's me. But what they're seeing, of course, is a representation of themselves outside of themselves, right? The representation in the mirror, which they mistake as themselves. They are understanding themselves as separate from the world, as an individual, but only through the process of a representation of themselves. He then goes on to make this less literal. Mirroring is not just a literal reflective surface. Mirroring is something that occurs when we see something outside of ourselves and we gain a sense of ourselves in relation to that thing or person or representation that mirrors us back to ourselves, that gives us some insight on ourselves, that validates us, that gives us value, that pushes us in a particular direction. So an example of this is, and we see this all the time, a child, let's start with a girl child, who does something that is in line with societal expectations about what girls are supposed to do or how they're supposed to be. And I'm just going to use a very stereotypical and crass example. Let's say the young girl picks up a little pretty bow and puts it in her hair and looks at herself in the mirror, looks at mom for affirmation. And the mom, because she is herself a product of societal expectations, gives positive feedback for that action. Oh, honey, you're very cute. That's very pretty. Good for you. And reinforces the idea of being pretty as something that a girl should do. And you can see the other one, a young boy child does something that is, let's say he's building with blocks or he kicks a ball and the mother says, oh, honey, that's so strong, that's so smart, or whatever it might be, and gives value to things that align themselves with societal expectations about being male or being female. Now, as that child develops and enters into the symbolic realm, which is full entry into the field of representation, kind of full access to language and so forth, and really keeps developing their sense of self, this continues to occur all the way through their lives. So it goes from, let's say, the family situation to a child then getting validation from peer groups for particular behaviors or particular appearances that, again, are in line with societal expectations, which are, of course, informed by ideological assumptions about what masculinity and femininity should be. That then progresses into identifying with things that are representations. It could be a TV show that, puts forth a particular idea of what a woman is or a man is, even if it's subliminal, just little tiny clues that, of course, children who are sponges just absorb like crazy. And we continue to do that over the course of our life, right? So that it goes from family to peers to representations at large, books, magazines, movies, even, pop stars who we look at and say, oh, I want to be like that. I identify with that. The question is why we identify with that, right? Why we want to be like that. And we'll come back to that. Now here, Jacques Lacan, and we've heard this term, I'm sure you all have before, the male gaze. That's actually a bastardization of Jacques Lacan's idea of the gaze. He doesn't give it a gender. What Jacques Lacan says is that the gaze is basically the world or the field of representations, which includes people, but it also includes just representations in general, that mirrors back to us, ways to behave, ways to comport ourselves, things to identify with, that we're constantly kind of seeing ourselves in relation to. When I gave you the example of, the panopticon, think of the gaze as being that guard tower and that guard tower is filled with all the societal expectations that are in the form of representations and people who have internalized them, that we see ourselves through, that we've internalized, that is kind of what is the component of our self-surveillance by which we, fashion ourselves in accordance to. As he says, it's the field of representation that legislates and defines our sense of self, right? We are subject to these representations. That's why we use the term subjectivity, right? That we are subject to representations around us. Identity literally means the self-same, right? So that you're born in the world with a unique sense of self that comes to fruition. And what these thinkers are saying is that no, you're basically born into the world, maybe with some predilections for certain things that move you in one way or another, but what is most constitutive of your sense of self and continues to inflect how you understand yourselves and others are representations in the world, whether they come from people or signs, right? Various representations through which you see yourself and basically fashion yourself in accordance with. Now, if that's the case, if it's true that representations have such a constituent effect on our sense of self and the way that we see others, if they are informed by presumptions that are not true, but are rather, presumptions that are based upon ideological assumptions in the world, then what the second generation of feminist artists want to do is to draw our attention to, first of all, how important representations are when it comes to, in this argument, gender, right? How they really construct the idea of gender in the first place, and that we fashion ourselves in accordance to these expectations. And let me just pause here for a minute. What this means, too, is I'm not saying that you are necessarily going to always perform the stereotype. And that's not what they're saying either. You're not necessarily just going to fit yourself into the most traditional expectations of what a gender is. But that even when you resist them, even when you seek an alternative for them, you are reacting at least negatively to that expectation. And that negative reaction, again, informs the possibilities of what you find as, an alternative to those expectations. So if this is so important, they want to draw your attention to the way that this works on the one hand. They want to raise your awareness of how gender is a construct that creates unequal relations to power between the sexes, right? That the man, if we go back to that bipolar field or binary between male and female, we see that one side is almost always privileged over the other, that it separates those and says women can't be these things that are men. They want to collapse and deconstruct that. So they want to draw our attention to how representations work, but they also want to draw your attention to how you might resist and deconstruct these constructed ideas about gender in the world around you. Yeah. So another thing that I want to bring up before we go into Cindy Sherman's work here is how important interpretation is in this whole equation. One of the key thinkers in post-structuralist thinking is Roland Barthes, who is a semiotician, who once wrote this famous article called The Death of the Author. And what he meant by that was that, representations are not, their meaning is not determined solely by the author, by the person who wrote them. Intentions are only part of the equation. What is really important in any situation in which meaning occurs is the locus of the viewer or the reader, right? The interpretant. We interpret what we see, we interpret representations according to what we already know. We interpret these according to what we bring to them as well, right? When we interpret a text or we interpret an image, we're not just seeking a meaning that already exists in the image, right? That the meaning's already there. The interpretation itself takes place between these two poles of what the representation gives us as well as what we bring to the representation. But the reason I wanted to point this out and the way that this gets expanded is that when we interpret things, we are interpreting according to presumptions and ideological assumptions that we hold, that we may or may not be fully aware of. This is very important for our class here, to be aware that we are all prejudiced. And I don't mean this in a bad way, although in many instances we may become aware of certain prejudices that we hold that are pernicious, that are difficult, that are destructive or violent in one way. And I don't mean physically violent, I mean psychically violent when we hold them and we project them onto others. But let's go back to this. What do I mean by that we're all prejudiced? What I mean is that the very way that human knowledge functions is according to presumptions that we already hold, right? We don't meet the world afresh at every moment and have to see things anew at every moment. We're very efficient beings. And so we oftentimes take things that we've already come to understand. These are our filters, our lenses, and we see the world through those presumptions. Prejudice literally means prejudgment. We have to prejudge things in the world so as to make sense of them in a very economical way. Some of those presumptions and prejudices are problematic. We get to determine those based upon our own values, right? We can be aware of those and reflect on those. And a lot of these works of art that we're looking at really focus your attention on the way that you're interpreting them. When you're interpreting them, you might realize that in the process of interpreting something, you are relying on a set of presumptions that you have inherited from the world around you. Big ideological assumptions in this case that come from our understanding of gender, right? And so that's very important for these works. They're catalysts for our own discovery of the prejudices that we might hold so that we can bring those to light and deconstruct them, be more aware of them, and change them ultimately. Okay, that's the end of part 1 of this lecture. I'll come back with part 2.